In recent entries to the Legend of Zelda franchise, there's been a slow but obvious change in style that's become something of a trend. Beginning with A Link to the Past, but more prominently starting with Majora's Mask, Zelda as a series has steadily been going in a more story-based direction, revolving around themes and especially character focus. It's no coincidence that the series' most memorable and popular characters, like Zant, Midna, and Groose, came in the later games. But the recently released, incredibly and almost universally critically acclaimed Breath of the Wild dials this trend back entirely. Perhaps in response to criticism and wish lists from popular reviewers like Matthew Matosis and Ecoraptor, Nintendo made Breath of the Wild much more exploration and gameplay focused, with much less emphasis on a cohesive story than its predecessors. This much is undeniable. In Nintendo's most recent entry, there are large stretches of game with little to no narrative content, and the story elements themselves are just not as emphasized as in past titles. Please don't mistake me, because this is not a criticism, but just a fact. But another fact is that when Breath of the Wild does tackle its story, it does so in a very interesting way. A way that integrates aspects from a huge number of game elements to create a very personal and unique story experience. I have to say that my initial impression of Breath of the Wild was a little bit underwhelming for an admittedly pretty minimal, but important reason: the lack of a proper title screen. Dynamic title screens in 3D Zeldas have been a staple for good reason. They're a terrific tool for immediately engaging the viewer, giving them a glimpse of the story, and most importantly, setting a tone. Ocarina showed off its, at the time, vast landscape juxtaposed with its somber title theme music to show off both how personal and grand the story was. Majora's Mask did an excellent job with its title screen, immediately and disturbingly displaying that something was very darkly wrong in this otherwise seemingly cheerful world. Wind Waker's visuals and music were an instant snapshot of the lighter and more imaginative style of game this was, and Twilight Princess contains my personal favorite Zelda title screen, a melancholic and beautiful piece that displays both the epic scale and strange darkness of the story through its visuals and music. On the other hand, Breath of the Wild's approach is minimalistic to say the least. There's no music, and the entirety of the title screen just cycles through some pretty great still images. In comparison to the versions from the other 3D Zeldas, Breath of the Wild's was not engaging at all. Either the developers got lazy here, which I doubt, or they undervalued the importance of 3D Zelda's classic title screens. Either way, it was disappointing. I can kind of see an argument for this title screen stating that this sort of style illustrated the quiet beauty and hushed tone of the game well, but I can think of tons of ways to produce that end result with a more dynamic title screen than what we got, and I'm not a game developer. When we move away from the title screen and into the game proper, however, we immediately become acquainted with the narrative. There are no slow and long introductory sequences such as in Twilight Princess or Skyward Sword. I might be in the minority in saying that I really like these long intros in Zelda games because of how they establish things and produce the mundane before things ramp up, but Breath of the Wild didn't need this because it took a different approach that filled in the setting and past events as the player progresses. We immediately figure out that this is a post-apocalypse, and that the bulk of the game's story will consist of putting together the pieces of the past, finding out what Link's done to get himself in this situation, and what's happened to the world. And this is pretty much the essence of the narrative. If you think about the plot of Breath of the Wild, calling it threadbare would be an understatement. The plot is almost non-existent, and in essence can be summed up with: Link wakes up, Link gets stronger by defeating and recruiting the Divine Beasts, Link defeats Ganon and saves Zelda. You technically don't even need to enlist the Divine Beasts to beat the game. Even if you consider the past plot formed by the memories collected throughout to be the proper narrative of the game, it's still very straightforward. But while this game was less story-focused than its predecessors, it does still have a story focus, and I think that a lot of times people tend to confuse plot with story, which can lead to the misinformed idea that Breath of the Wild has no story. A plot consists of a story's major events, but a story itself is much more than its events. A plot is essentially the skeleton of the story, whereas the other aspects such as the setting, themes, tone, and characters make up the true meat of the experience. A brilliant story can be more plot-based, such as Xenoblade Chronicles, Xenogears, Final Fantasy VII, or Naoki Urasawa's Monster, but as long as the other aspects of the work can compensate for it, a threadbare plot is not inherently an issue. Stories like The Witcher 3 or the Elder Scrolls series have a simplistic plot, but the magnified focus on the other aforementioned story aspects make up for it to form a fulfilling experience. And if these other aspects feed into each other in a cohesive way, then the story can be formulated and can be monumentally good. Back to the topic at hand, while Breath of the Wild doesn't have much in terms of plot, it has plenty of story. It's just told in a rather unconventional and un-Zelda way. Breath of the Wild is by far the most personal Zelda ever made. A lot of the story experience is dependent on the imagination of the player, given just enough inspiration by the game itself to form one's own personal narrative. Since so much of the gameplay is variable and built on improvisation, a lot of what one takes away from Breath of the Wild will be dependent on their own personalized experiences of the game. No two people will have a very similar experience with this one, and I think this is fantastic. Not only does it encourage replays, but it ensures that each player will have their own unique relationship with the game. Due to this, a lot of Breath of the Wild's story is naturally built and individualized to the way each player plays it, and this is a concept that is already present to an extent in a lot of modern open-world games, but here it's both taken to nearly untouched levels and applied to a series for which we haven't seen something like this before. We might all be able to relate to the feeling of making it to the top of a tower and breathing in the beautiful view, but each of our journeys in getting there and climbing that tower are different. One player will remember how they were a pixel away from losing their stamina and falling off, while another will remember having to stealthily climb up to avoid enemies, while another will remember paragliding to the tower from a far-off hill and taking in the odd beauty of a storm on the way. This nature of individual difference is everywhere in Breath of the Wild, thanks to the freedom enabled by the developers. From defeating enemies in combat using any number of disposable weapons, to the variability of the puzzles, to simple exploration. And I think that this was a great design decision because of the sandbox-like personal stories that can be formed from a game with this structure. On a somewhat related note, I want to draw attention to the implications that a post-apocalyptic setting can bring about. A story based in a setting that has gone through, or is going through a disaster that doesn't ponder on how that disaster came about and the effect that it had, is ineffective in my eyes. Luckily, Breath of the Wild spends a great deal of the time reflecting on how the world came to be like this, and its main way of tackling this is through memories. Throughout the game, there are a total of 18 memories that are available for the player to view once they find them, and each gives a little bit of insight into what the past was like and what brought the setting, Link, and Zelda to the state that they're currently in, along with some valuable characterization tidbits. Now, do me a favor and hold that thought, because I'm going to pause here and bring up one of my all-time favorite games, BioShock. And I promise that there's a point to this. To those unfamiliar with the game, BioShock is a pseudo-post-apocalyptic tale that takes place in an alternate reality where mankind has found the means, inspiration, and intellect to build a city under the sea called Rapture. During the time span of the game, Rapture has fallen to ruin due to a mix of selfish political motivations, the rise of supernatural powers, and the dark nature of man. Much like Breath of the Wild, the player is thrust into the world of BioShock without introduction, and much like Breath of the Wild, the establishment of the setting is gradually filled in as the game progresses. This is done through audio diaries scattered throughout the world, in which characters that used to live in a once thriving Rapture recorded their thoughts on their new lives.
Diane, my dear, I'm sorry, but I'll be late again tonight. Rosenberg is demanding to speak about this Fontaine business. I'm trying to build a proper financial market, and this idiot keeps going on about atom this, and genetic modification, that. I'll go spend an hour pretending to pay attention to the poor fellow and be home as soon as I can. Andre.
These audio diaries form the bulk of the story in BioShock, and in paying attention to them we can come to realize what led Rapture to ruin. I've always considered this stylistic choice to be a masterstroke on the part of the developers of BioShock. But the question is, why does this work better than a classic story structure? Aside from absolutely stunning sound design, my answer would consist of one word: imagination. These diaries work because they give us a glimpse, but not the full picture, of the past, and let us fill in the rest with our imagination based off of the desolate ruin that Rapture is now, what Rapture once was, and the little story events we hear through the audio diaries. Using what the game gives us as a guide, our mind can fill in the gaps of what happened in the past, and our imagination can be more vivid and effective than any type of visual media. Just listen to this one, and tell me that any visual information could properly convey what you imagine to be happening in this moment.
Faroe silk, and done.
The nose looks terrific, Dr. Steinman. Doctor?
You know, looking at it now. I didn't realize how much her face sags. Scalpel?
Excuse me?
Scalpel.
Doctor, she's not booked for a facelift.
Let's just come in here and...
Doctor, stop cutting. Doctor, stop cutting. Get me the chief of surgery. Get me the chief of surgery now!
Nothing presented can do this moment justice compared to the madness that you envision in your mind's eye here. This is why books are such an effective fictional medium, and why so many people are disappointed with film or TV adaptations of their favorite book series, because nothing can ever live up to the narrative interpretation that they've formed in their mind. BioShock's audio diaries provide us with just enough background information on the story so that we have a sense of structure to base how we imagine these events to be, and yet that information is sparse enough so that we can interpret and construct our own abstract visual narrative. Note that the audio diaries were first used in BioShock's spiritual successor, System Shock 2. Now, shifting back to Breath of the Wild, I think that it either consciously or subconsciously draws from BioShock's method of imagination-based storytelling. I don't think that this is implemented or achieved as well as it is in BioShock, but this sort of presentation is quite similar. The memories that we are shown as we progress through the game provide an emotional foundation for the story, establish Zelda and her champions as characters, and characterize Link, but most importantly of all, they provide us with just the right amount of specific story moments for our minds to fill in the gaps of what has happened in between each. If viewed chronologically, these memories form a very cohesive plot, yet one that is obviously open to interpretation due to the gaps. It's sort of like exposition via suggestion. And when things really start to get dark and things start going wrong in these memories, the tragedy really hits home when we imagine all of the destruction and death that has occurred, while witnessing Zelda completely broken in Link's arms. It wasn't just the memories that had this effect either. One of my favorite story moments in the game was reading through Zelda's diary in the midst of Calamity Ganon's storm. The music, the devastating imagery, and the words all feeding in to how horrible I imagined the downfall of Hyrule to be. This was all an interesting departure from the regular storytelling style of past Zeldas, and one that results in a much less set story experience from person to person. This dynamic nature adds to the plot in itself, and makes Breath of the Wild a much more intimate experience than it might have been otherwise. But aside from this dynamism, it also leans on more conventional means to form a story experience. The main theme of Breath of the Wild is loneliness. There are secondary themes that rear their heads, but the core of the experience is very clearly an evocative tone piece, meant to make the player feel what the characters in the setting feel. This world is beautiful, but it's also lonely. And the story is about finding one's place in desolation and fighting for a better future, despite the seemingly inescapable bog that this isolation makes one feel like they're wading through. Lots of little individual elements feed into this theme as well. For the first time in a 3D Zelda, we find ourselves without a companion. Partners in the Zelda franchise have ranged from the annoying to the, well, amazing, but they've constantly provided Link and the players with support and someone to keep them company. But in Breath of the Wild, we have no one. We have a much more intimate connection with nature in this one, likely because there's nothing to distract us from the aching beauty of being alone in a vast land. The music also contributes to this, being notably subdued in the overworld, relying on subtle little piano pieces without any cadence or rhythm to promote introspection. These songs are in stark contrast to the overworld themes of the past, which were upbeat and epic. While past overworld themes evoked feelings of adventure to pump the player up, Breath of the Wild's soundtrack cares much more about having the player stop and observe the world and gorgeous desolation around them. The memory-based, imagination-fueled storytelling feeds into this loneliness incredibly well too, as you see a memory rooted in a vibrant and positive past, and imagine how amazing that past must have been, and then it all fades away, and you once again realize that you're on your own in a world in which the attempts have failed. Hyrule has always sort of been like a character in itself, but the scenic setting in Breath of the Wild is absolutely and especially essential to the experience. In a departure from the stereotypical post-apocalypse, the world is fluid, bright, and beautiful, far removed from the dull grays, browns, and blacks of your Fallouts. This isn't a knock on Fallout whatsoever, but instead a stylistic observation. In Fallout, there's no hope of restoring the setting to its former glory, so aesthetically we have a rough, ugly terrain, driving home a darker tone. But in Breath of the Wild, the entire premise revolves around getting this setting back to its feet, so showing us an attractive world is enticing and effective. The beauty of Hyrule hasn't disappeared from 100 years ago. It's still very much there. It's just very notably empty, waiting to be filled with life and love again. And this is all of the motivation that I needed to truly want to restore the world. But as expansive as the overworld is, I found the villages and settlements scattered sparsely around the game to be phenomenal. In a game that's blanketed by feelings of isolation, coming across travelers, and especially little towns, was an absolute treat and a moment of respite. Breath of the Wild clearly takes inspiration from Studio Ghibli films in formulating its world, and this is more obvious than ever in the towns. These places are absolutely steeped in culture and vibrancy, with each little village having their own customs, beliefs, and traditions. The people, while also adding indirect world building and lore tidbits through their dialogue, are bright and positive, which is a very welcome juxtaposition in relation to the somber open world, and a reminder of what Link is fighting to achieve. Hayao Miyazaki, the co-founder of Studio Ghibli, is of the belief that people are very much in tune with and even a part of nature, and this is an idea that's evident throughout Breath of the Wild. From the Rito village and their deep bond with the environment, to the Gorons who interact with nature on a regular basis, to the Koroks of the Lost Woods who are extremely reminiscent of the Kodama from Princess Mononoke, this is a world where nature and people are intertwined. And this completely enriches the experience, while making the player feel closer to the world than they otherwise would have. It contributes to making the loneliness throughout the game a type of solitude founded in solace and hope, rather than anxiety or stress. It's a very fine balance that was struck through the world building to make this game feel lonely, but not empty, sad but not depressing, contemplative but not brooding. And all of this helped to achieve a very consistent tone and atmosphere unlike anything I've ever experienced in a game before. The characters in this game were a bit of a mixed bag for me. On one hand, the random travelers that we see pop up across the land were everything that they needed to be. I found everything to do with cast to be a particular highlight here. Zelda herself was characterized extremely well, and had a pretty complete character arc that again dwelled on a lonely journey, as she continuously struggled in vain to find her power. At the same time, her father's realization that he had been treating his kin as a soldier rather than a daughter hit hard, after realizing that he never really got the chance to show his love for her after making this discovery. And I have to applaud the game for finally giving Link an in-game reason for being silent, because it's more than we've gotten in the past titles. But almost every semi-major character apart from Zelda could have been explored deeper for me. In general, Breath of the Wild handles its characters with care, but without too much depth. Despite this though, I found that the four Guardians were interestingly characterized in relation to the themes of the game. Each one had something important associated with them that related back to the core themes of Breath of the Wild. Urbosa represented strength and perseverance through tragedy, Rivali displayed pride and positivity in the face of devastation, and Daruk was a demonstration of courage and charisma. Although all of these ideas are pretty similar in their impact, the fourth Guardian was tackled a little bit differently. While the aforementioned trio represented striving against loneliness and adversity, the most poignant character for me was Mipha, who displayed the tragedy of loneliness. Mipha is a fan favorite and a powerful character because she exemplifies this feeling of isolation. She's so adored by her people, missed by her loved ones, and valued by the kingdom, but she's ironically unloved by the man that she so wishes could be the one for her. Not only is her story based on unrequited love tragic in and of itself, but her solitary story is totally consistent with the themes and tone of the work as a whole, and I think that makes her resonate so much as a character. She's also just a sweetheart, but hey. Breath of the Wild uses an amalgamation of setting, theming, tone, characters, intimate variability, and interpretive storytelling to form its narrative. All of this combined to make this game a masterstroke in conveying a story of loneliness, which made the slow ascent to power before beating Calamity Ganon incredibly gratifying. Of course, this game is still flawed when it came to story execution, despite how impressive certain aspects of it were. In general, I think that it was too underplayed. I already mentioned the lack of a title screen being a bit of a nitpicky weakness for me, but I think that the game would have benefited from a bit more story focus than what we got. I know this is a bit paradoxical and odd coming from a guy who just talked about this game's story for so long, but I think that it could have been more fleshed out. Like I said, the characters were all well characterized, but I wish that we could have seen them developed a bit more, especially ones like Rivali or Daruk. We essentially get a snapshot of what each was like before the Calamity, with a bit more emphasis on Mipha, and that's about it. And while I'm definitely a fan of the interpretation and imagination-based story approach taken here, I kind of wish that the game didn't lean on it so heavily, and actually showed a bit more of how Hyrule functioned in the past, rather than telling us or leaving it to the imagination. I'm also much more of a fan of the human incarnations of Ganondorf that we've seen in Twilight Princess or Wind Waker, than the bestial or force of nature like Ganon that we got in this game. I find that a human final boss adds more focus, complexity, and weight to a final confrontation, so while the battle was suitably epic, I was a bit disappointed in what we got with Calamity Ganon in Breath of the Wild in terms of the emotional and intimate resonance of the fight. Note that I was still pleased with Ganon, and that an inhuman final boss can be done properly, with Chrono Trigger as the textbook example, and it was done properly here. This was just a matter of personal preference. I do see that a primitive force of nature as a final boss, in a game that emphasizes nature, is thematically appropriate in illustrating the duality of nature, but I couldn't help feeling that I missed something like the internal characterized narrative of the Twilight Princess fight during Breath of the Wild's climax. I also would have preferred a much more substantial resolution in the game, where we'd see more of what happened in the world after the dust settled, and what happened with all of these characters that we had gotten to know. And this doesn't have to do with story, but I would be remiss if I didn't complain just a little bit about how damn weak the durability of some weapons were. But like I said, these are all personal issues that I had with the game that didn't detract too much from the experience. I genuinely feel like Nintendo paid attention to fan feedback when planning Breath of the Wild. The game clearly takes criticism aimed at the perceived lack of proper exploration and freedom that was directed to the more recent story-focused entries of the series, and I give major props to them for this. The ability of a gargantuan company like Nintendo to pay attention to fan criticism is admirable as hell. While I do take issue with some design choices, by and large it worked, because Breath of the Wild is great. It's a truly poetic game that says so much by saying so little. While not without problems, it's probably my second or third favorite Zelda of all time, and that's saying something. Feel free to let me know what you thought about my interpretation of this game's storytelling style, and what you think about its story. This is my first Zelda video, and I'm curious to know what you guys thought of this game, as it is a pretty huge topic at the moment. Cheers for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.